The events in the South China Sea in recent months has been based around the continued threats by China to reunify with Taiwan by force if necessary, and the ongoing escalations within the Philippines' internationally recognized Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. The Chinese aggressive claims in the region that are not recognized by most of the world have created a situation of a gathering alliance of disparate countries that all have a single goal to challenge China's claims at some level and tip the scale of power away from China in the Western Pacific. India is a significant developing country that has a tense relationship with China and has been uniquely quiet over the Chinese claims in the South China Sea. This past approach by India might be coming to an end, and it starts to weigh in on the South China issue and do so against China's interest. But why? India has a complex relationship with both China and the gathering alliance that is composed of Western-aligned countries. India is part of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which is an organization that was formed by the 5 founding names in the title in 2009, but now comprise of 9 countries. The bloc is a formation of developing countries that want to challenge the order of the developed G7 countries. One of the purposes of the bloc is to counterbalance the traditional influence of the West when it comes to global trade and financing. So, India is in a formal agreement with China and shares many of the same goals of the BRICS organization. India and China have both been involved in the purchases of Russian oil that has been under sanctions since the West targeted Russian oil sales after its invasion of Ukraine. The two countries buy this Russian oil at a discount price, as Russia uses discounting to incentivize countries to buy Russian oil, despite the risk of antagonizing the West in its sanctions. The West does not appear to be intent on eliminating Russian oil sales altogether, but try to make it difficult to transport without risking sanctions, and is also capping the maximum price Russia can sell its oil. India has made this decision out of self-interest to maintain a cheaper flow of energy to its growing economy, and not because of some support for Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. The fact, though, is that China and India are aligned in purchasing Russian oil, though India is more cautious to not flout the sanction rules of the West when compared to China. Despite the two most populous countries in the world having these activities in common, there is a long history of suspicion and acrimony between the two countries that places a strain between them and any alliance or agreement they share. India is receiving an economic windfall from the Western decoupling initiatives from China that is meant to diversify supply chains from China that the COVID-19 pandemic exposed as being an Achilles heel of the West, being too dependent on China to produce essential goods. India has an incentive to support the West to make it an attractive option to shift its supply chains. India's population now exceeds China's and is growing while China's, mainly due to the disastrous impact of the one-child policy, is growing older and is now past its peak size population and labor pool. The two population sizes are diverging, which gives India the advantage of providing labor at a generally lower cost and can do so without all the Chinese Communist Party's interference and harassment of foreign companies operating in China. India, by contrast, provides a more rule-based economy that is more compatible with the West when compared to China. This is a strain between the two countries, especially as China is facing significant economic and financial challenges that could cause social disruptions. Chinese and Indian troops have a history of border disputes and clashes, with the latest clashes started in 2020, as the two have armed forces facing off with each other in the Himalayas along Pangong Lake and the Tibet Autonomous Region. Both countries are attempting to restrain their troops in the remote region, so an unintentional battle does not start, but both sides are building an infrastructure in the mountainous terrain so that they could get their reinforcements in the area faster and in greater numbers than the other side. Both are taking an approach of whoever can reinforce faster and at greater volumes will most likely prevail in a future conflict. Both countries have interests in the ongoing civil war in Myanmar, as both sides try to get control of their common borders with Myanmar. China is also damming rivers that flow from China to its southern neighbors, which threatens lifestyles and ecologies of the downriver countries of India and Bangladesh, which borders India. China chose this action to dam rivers and cut off water to its southern neighbors in the same way it declared the South China Sea as their sovereign territory. China wanted the natural resources of the rivers, hydroelectric power, so it decided that it was the sole owner of the natural resources and was going to act in its own interest. Resources were found in the South China Sea, so China just declared its sovereign rights over it. So a pattern is being standardized by China. India has experienced the arrogance of China firsthand, and this is incentivizing it to get involved in the South China Sea. India and the Philippines have a history of close cooperation with each other, and in March 2024, India's Foreign Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar went to Manila to visit with the Philippine government in the backdrop of its escalating tensions with China. The Mr. Jaishankar, ahead of his arrival, made the Indian government position clear in that it wanted a rules-based order in the South China Sea. The fact that India made the statement ahead of a visit to Manila while the escalating tensions are at their highest point over conflicting stances in the region is telling. It has created questions if India is trying to influence the strategic balance in the region away from China. This position aligns with the Philippines and Western-aligned countries and demonstrates that India is taking a side in the region that is contrary to China's position. India stated that both countries had a deep interest in a free and inclusive Indo-Pacific Ocean, which is contrary to China's declaratory sovereign claims over the South China Sea. The two countries agreed to have extensive discussions on how to improve defense and security cooperation in the region. The announcement by India is another antagonism toward China as it disregards the Chinese insistence that no foreign elements to be introduced into the disputes in the South China Sea. The point of the visit was emphasized when an Indian Coast Guard ship visited Manila while Minister Jaishankar was there, and both countries announced the two countries would hold more joint naval drills. India made the point that it was also had a close security partnership with the US and Japan in the Asia-Pacific region. India also made a controversial decision to sell BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles that were developed as a joint project with Russia to the Philippines. India had not offered the sales in the past because it did not want to upset China. The erosion of the situation in the South China Sea and China's predatory approach to territorial claims across the globe, including to India's security and economic interests, has created a change to the Indian calculus. India has not limited itself to the Philippines, but has entered into agreements with Vietnam to provide military support to them as well. Vietnam, like the Philippines, has territorial issues with China in the South China Sea and the Gulf of Tonkin, and is impacted by China's decision to dam rivers. So India is entering the disputes in the region, but it is unclear how far it will go. Will it limit itself to only providing arms and support to countries with disputes with China, or will it weigh in more directly with a military presence in the region? India has two primary focuses for its naval forces, and that is the promotion of free access to the South China Sea to promote its economic growth, and China's action in the South China Sea threatens that goal. The other is for it to remain the preeminent naval power in the Indian Ocean, so having a physical and ongoing presence in the South China Sea dispute could compromise that position. India must be aware that China is creating a naval presence in the Indian Ocean through port agreements to operate the People's Liberation Army Navy in Myanmar and Pakistan. The issue for India is that these two goals can become diametrically opposed to each other if the Chinese decide to close the South China Sea and threaten India's economic growth while the Indian Navy stays concentrated in the Indian Ocean and not defy any aggressive Chinese action in the South China Sea. At some point, India may have to choose to get involved directly or rely on countries it supports with weapons and training to keep the maritime route open for its economy. The Indian government by nature is cautious when it comes to foreign entanglements, especially with a powerful China. It knows that it cannot defeat China on its own, and it needs more time to grow its economy to become a peer threat to China. Supporting the Western-aligned nations to establish freedom of navigation and supporting Western Chinese decoupling efforts will both help Indian long-term economic growth, so India does have a motivating interest to choose a side to help it achieve its goals. On the other hand, India does not allow itself to be cowed by China when it sees that its self-interests are served as well by willing to mirror Chinese aggression as it does in the Himalayas. It will continue to work with China in attaining the goals of BRICS or cooperate with China to purchase Russian discounted oil because it again serves the Indian long-term goal of economic expansion, which largely comes at China's expense. It can be expected that India will not commit itself to an aggressive stance in the South China Sea, but is willing to put its thumb on the scale in the hope that can tip the scale by forcing a change in the Chinese position of making aggressive and declaratory territorial demands that threatens Indian interests or security.